of natural ecosystems. It focuses the challenges of sustainability on environmental issues, including the management of soil fertility, the genetic diversity of plants, water management and waste recycling, but also on the circumstances and social and economic needs of resource-poor farmers. It makes use of the knowledge and techniques that people themselves control and use to enhance their prosperity. Prosperity understood as well-being, autonomy, management of the environment, social connections and cultures, as opposed to just being a matter of incomes and growth. Agroecology is based on innovative forms of collaboration between scientists, farmers, and social movements. What's important here is diversity of approach, because diversity of approach is key to future human flourishing. To succeed, it has to work with mixes of different crops and marketable products, including livestock and wild and semi-domesticated foods. Now, what's important about that mix is it does something more than just protect the system today. And this is because humans have historically used about 7,000 plant species as food. But today, 3 plant species, wheat, rice, and maize, now account for 60% of the calories consumed by the 7 billion people who live on this planet. The problem we have is that climate change, particularly temperature rises and CO2 levels, will affect both the yields and, much more importantly, the nutritional content of these 3 key crops. So perhaps we need to redirect our research and our resources to the currently undervalued and neglected alternative species that we have around us, but that we have not thought about hardly at all in the last 60 years as we've been on our path towards development. In 2014, the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, finally acknowledged and decided to provide support for agroecology worldwide. So perhaps this is a sign that things are changing, that forms of knowledge and the skills that ordinary people possess will be acknowledged as what makes the societies of the future flourish. Models coming from the Global South. There are many examples of new thinking from the Global South that provide examples of new ways of approaching difficult issues. Let's just take an example I'm particularly fond of, and it's about cities. Today, 54% of the world's population live in cities. By 2050, it will be nearer to 70%. Much of that increase will be concentrated in Africa and Asia. By 2050, India will add 404 million new urban dwellers, China 292 million, and Nigeria 212 million. These new urban dwellers will create new needs for housing, infrastructure, transport, energy and employment, as well, of course, for education and health. The success or failure in building sustainable cities is one of the major challenges of the next 15 years, because by 2030, city populations will already be 5 billion, and on current projections, 2 billion of those people will be living below the poverty line. Let me give you an example. A little over 10 years ago, a visionary architect from Chile, Alejandro Aravena, was given a problem. His problem, too, involved half a hectare of land. But this half hectare of land is in the centre of Iquique city in Chile. 100 families had occupied this land illegally for 30 years, and it needed redeveloping. Now, the standard answer to slums and social housing is, of course, that when you have problems with them, you raze them to the ground, you move people out to new developments outside the city centres, where often there's no employment, no transport, no services, and no backup. So Alejandro Aravena decided to work with these 100 families so that they could come up with a solution together. He had a budget. He had to buy the land, provide all the infrastructure and all the architecture, and the budget was $7,500 per family. Now, building detached houses on this plot in the middle of Iquique would have been too expensive and would only have provided accommodation for 30 families. Perhaps high-rises would have been the answer, but high-rises wouldn't have allowed the families to expand their houses as they grew. Fortunately for these families, Mr. Aravena's motto is the more complex the problem, the more the need for simplicity, for clear thinking, for ideas. So he went to the families themselves, who after all had originally built the area they were living in. And the result was not only did the architect and the families join forces, but they split the tasks at hand. Middle-class houses were built for all families on the site to keep them close to work, schools and services. But the innovation was that Alejandro Aravena only built each family half a middle-class house. The difficult half, the structure, the roof, the kitchen and the bathroom. The rest they built for themselves. The answer as to how to solve the problem of favelas and slums came from these favelas and slums themselves. As he said, we won't ever solve the problem unless we use people's own capacity to build. True social innovation. It turned social housing from a cost in the present to an investment for the future. And this model has now been rolled out in at least 13 other sites in Chile and Mexico. Now, what I think this demonstrates is the importance of what I call collaborative experimentation. Incomplete learning, in this case, incomplete houses, based on cooperation, south-to-south cooperation. And we need, I think, to have more social, political, and economic experimentation rather than to be following one model. Now, historically, development has depended on exporting and imposing models with supposedly known outcomes as solutions to the challenges faced in the global south. But if we focus the future on prosperity, on broader understandings of human flourishing, rather than on economic development based on growth, we will have to accept that the prosperous societies of the future will be very diverse, since the principles of the good life, of morality, of values are all diverse, as are the definitions of success, well-being, sustainability, and aspiration. In such contexts as these, learning will not be about the transferability of whole models with known outcomes, but rather about incomplete learning, experimentation, and collaboration. In September this year, the UN member states will set the Sustainable Development Goals for the next 15 years. The period 2015 to 2030 is time critical for climate change, for CO2 emissions, for the proper management of water. But I want to suggest that this period is also time critical for new ideas and social innovation. And my plea to all of you listening would be switch the points, jump the train tracks of history. We don't have much time. Thank you.
Henrietta, thank you. And I think that's sufficiently controversial for our audience here at the Blavatnik School, who come from all over the world. So your questions to Henrietta. Jordan Hussein, you're from Indonesia and you've worked in the President's Delivery Unit.
Do you think what is wrong is not the concept of development, but it's how we define development that actually should have an ownership of the people. Because I think the flow of capital from the north is still necessary for some countries in the world. But what needs to be changed is their ownership of the concept of this prosperity.
I think there's a very real need for development assistance to continue. It must continue. But I think that we need to change the single model of development that we have been working with, because we have to recognize that the future of human societies is going to be very diverse. There's not going to be one answer to these serious problems that we face on the planet today.
Diana Daher from Colombia.
You have argued that we need a new idea to replace development because it is an old-fashioned bottom-up concept. How should these ideas be created, and how could new generations move forward this process?
My feeling about this is that we need diversity of voices, diversity of experiences. And this is why it's so important to look at what's happening in different parts of the global south, where people are actually moving things forward, almost, if you like, below the radar. When we're talking generally about development, we don't hear about the Chilean architect that I've just talked about, Alejandro Aravena. What we hear about is that we can't do much about slums because we don't have the money and we don't have the resources. So I think that there's lots that the young generation can do, and the first thing they need to do is to shake off the ideas of the older generation and start looking around them for what's going to happen next.
Let me turn to Yasukano from the Ministry of Finance in Japan.
In the recent history of Asia, the sustainable growth was not by development aid, but by gradual upgrading of industries enhanced by the international free trade. When you talk about impossibility of the infinite growth, do you find it impossible to bring the recent achievement of East Asia into the rest of the world?
Trade will do a lot, but I am cautious about whether we will see in that situation enough uplift given the amount of resource constraint. Africa is facing the sharp end of the climate change crisis, as other countries are. In many parts of Africa, those soils are fragile. Water extraction is becoming more of a problem. So agricultural productivity can't continue to grow. You can't continue to produce for the export market in the same way unless something else is done. So if your growth model is the only model you have, in a sense you're going to run out of resource with which to produce the things that you need to trade with.
One last question.
Thank you. My name is Shagun. I'm from India. How can civil society organizations improve the diversity of approaches that you allude to, and what kind of networks do you think these organizations can form transnationally to influence the development goals in the future?
I think it's precisely that kind of solidarity across sharing of knowledge transnationally that will be important. I think this ability to get together and to have dialogue around really difficult issues without saying, look, this is the way it's done, just do that and you'll be fine. And I think that there are all kinds of issues which are particularly pressing. For example, things like delivery of improvements in healthcare. I think this is something where it's very obvious that you can learn from others who've taken steps. And I think the civil society organizations have a particularly important role to play here. Now, how exactly that works, I'm not sure. But I hope maybe if you do, that you start that conversation.
Well, I'm not sure we're all agreed on the end of development, but I'm afraid it is the end of this programme. So thank you to the students who have put their questions here and put our lecturer on the spot. But most of all, on behalf of the BBC and the Blavatnik School of Government here at Oxford University, my thanks to Professor Henrietta Moore.
Analysis. The End of Development lecture was given by Professor Henrietta Moore. It was chaired by Professor Nairi Woods and produced by Julie Ball.
What kind of joke makes Jenny Murray chuckle or John Humphreys guffaw?
This isn't really a joke. Well, it is. It's funny, I think. But it's a poem.
It's very difficult to think of a joke that's broadcastable. This is the only one I really know that's clean.
On Red Nose Day, Radio 4 presenters are telling their favourite jokes throughout the day.
I love it. I don't get the opportunity in You and Yours to tell a lot of jokes, though we do our best.
Lots of jokes go in, but not very many come out.
Red Nose Day on Radio 4, this Friday, and on the BBC Radio 4 website.
Well, it made me laugh anyway.